Right, good evening everyone. It's good to see a great turnout. This is an event organised as part of the Sheffield Festival of Debate programme, which is running several years. So the very first thing is just to set the scene by asking Jack to introduce the festival and how we fit into it.
Could I please? I found that difficult to hear. I'm sorry, my hearing is really, really bad.
Thank you for saying so.
So I'll ask you to raise your voice and interrupt you should it be necessary.
Thank you for saying so. Thank you.
Okay. Hi everybody. Sorry to keep you waiting there a little bit. My name's Jack. I work for the Festival of Debate.
Louder, please.
And we've got around 50 or 60 events that happen across the festival over the course of about 6 weeks. And that include like over 150 speakers covering all sorts of different topics. And the festival aims to explore the entangled ecological, economic, political and ecological, economic and political crises that we collectively face. And we hope to create spaces where people can talk about these sorts of things and then hopefully kind of use these spaces as a place from which positive change can be made. Most of the events are free. When we do need to charge, which we do for some of the larger events, then we try to make the tickets as affordable as possible. And if you'd like to make a donation, if you can afford to the festival, you can do so from the website, festivalofdebate.com. That's it really. I just wanted to say hello and tell you a bit about the festival, and just want to introduce and thank these people for coming and running this event today. So
Thank you.
that's it. Yeah.
So just to explain the format of the evening, we are going to have Si's going to introduce the speakers and say a little bit about the idea of the theme of tonight's theme. Each speaker will then have 15 minutes just to present what they want to say. Then there will be about 35 minutes for anybody from the floor to either ask for clarifications. I think it's best when we take those first, if you can specify that. But also anything up to really disagreeing with everything that you've heard and saying what you would wish you'd heard instead. And so it is a debate. It's the Festival of Debate, and this is going to be a debate, and so any opinion is important. If you can back up your opinion with some sort of evidence, that's even better. And I know some people are in campaigns that are very well informed and can do that. We particularly welcome young people, and if you are someone at either of the Sheffield universities who has a connection with any of the campaigns related to our campaigns in the two universities, we'd love to keep in touch with you. So, and there is, if anybody else would like to keep in touch, the portrait clipboard with the pen at the top on the table at the back there in the middle is for anybody to sign up if you would like to keep in touch with us. And the minimum that you'll get from us is a roughly monthly news update, which will include the latest online campaigns to sign, or you will have heard about tonight's meeting, that kind of thing. And occasionally we will publicise an event of a like-minded campaign that's doing something that we would like to support. So you'll just keep up with us locally. And Sheffield is quite a radical city, you know, it's good to get involved, so please join in. Just to say that after that, we've had about 35 minutes or so for that sort of feedback from the floor. Then each of the speakers will have 5 minutes just to reflect on what they've heard and feedback and give their sort of concluding thoughts. And there will actually, if there's still energy in the debate, then we have got time to carry on. We're not going to shut it down just because of the point on the clock. If you want to carry on debating, let's carry on debating. You know, but the whole focus of this is, particularly from the point of view of Global Justice Sheffield, which is one of 30 or 40 groups local groups across the country. Our role is to campaign from the grassroots, amongst everyday people, go out on the street, summer festivals, street stalls and so on, asking people to take an interest in the things that we think need fixing for a fairer world, a world for people and planet, not for profit. And tonight is specifically about what do we do about the power of profit. Because if you think of any problem that you would like changed for a better world, if you follow it back, probably it's a big wealthy corporation that's stopping you, either directly or because they've bought the politicians and are telling the politicians what to say instead of you telling the politicians what to say. So we need people power, and this is part of the process of building up people power. I'll hand over to Si, and thank you all for coming. Look forward to hearing what you've got to say.
So I'm just going to provide some context to tonight's event. And I want to begin with a quote from Matt Kennard, who's the chief investigative journalist at Declassified UK. And he said on a podcast called Politics Joe, "We cannot understand the world today unless you are looking at it through the lens of corporate power. That is the integral issue, and the fact that the state is not operating in the interests of people anymore, and that there is no form of democracy, is because it's been completely destroyed by corporations." So in essence, that is what this evening is going to unpick. We're going to explore the way in which corporations have become so powerful, how governments have aligned themselves fully with the interests of corporate power and the profit incentive of globalised business, and how this completely undermines the democratic process. In the words of the late but brilliant Benjamin Zephaniah, our votes mean very little when corporations and dirty dealers are pulling their corrupt strings in the background. He's a poet. Power is largely operated in the background. It goes mainly unreported. The power is operated through organisations that are hidden, even to those organisations in which they are based. And some of the ways in which this power is wielded is as indefensible as the ways in which power was wielded during the colonial period. Indeed, the structures that are created, such as the ISDS, the acronym Investor State Dispute Settlement, are designed to do that same job, to ensure the transfer of cheap land, cheap labour, raw materials and energy from the global south for the benefit of the elite in the global north. And the trickery of these structures of corporate power that have been described as the capitalist Magna Carta is that the appropriation can be hidden and largely done without the occupation, manufactured to seem normal, couched in the language of trade agreements and enforced through debt. And ISDS has been used over 1,000 times and is hugely detrimental to the transition from fossil fuels and for global south countries to develop infrastructure to raise living conditions for the majority. And just last week, the First Lady of Sierra Leone stated that corporate greed means that companies, every single one of them owned and operated from the global north, can take $100 million of resources from the country and pay just $10,000 for it. And that means that the people of Sierra Leone are still without electricity, running water, without an adequate health system. So the question is one of corporate greed or people's need. And it would be easy to feel that there's little we can do against such power, but I hope that this evening will demonstrate that this is not the case. Under that media radar, there is resistance across the global south against those corporations. Brave freedom fighters who are learning the intricacies of how power is wielded against them and confronting it. And the results have been spectacular. 2 examples. The victory in Cochabamba in Bolivia against a privatization of the water industries, which would have denied every person in that town any access to water, or the declaration of the first mining-free country in El Salvador fairly recently. So the aim of this evening is to listen to our three speakers who are going to expose the reality of globalised power, and then for all of us in this room to reflect, to share our knowledge, our local experience, so we can work out better how, in the words of Jeremy Corbyn, we can build a global movement powerful enough to secure our future. So that's the context. I want to now introduce our speakers. I'll introduce them as they come to speak. So I want to start with Tyrone Scott. Tyrone has come up from London today, came on the train, but he's not new to Sheffield. He studied here. He was at Sheffield Hallam.
Yes.
Yeah, Sheffield Hallam. Worked as a housing campaigner here, and it's good to have you back for the evening, Tyrone. He has many different hats. One is a trustee at the Rights Assembly charity, Article 11. But he's a senior movement building activism officer for War and Want, an organisation that works in the UK and with partners from around the world to fight poverty and to defend human rights. And I think it would be fair to say that wherever there is an issue of injustice that needs to be raised, from extractivism to climate and to the rights of marginalised people everywhere, then War on Want will be at the forefront of that campaign. In that role, Tyrone has organised the And Still We Rise Festival of Solidarity and Resistance, which brought people together to discuss how to build a collective movement to secure transformative change. So plenty of credentials to kick off there, Tyrone. Thank you.
Thanks. Do you want me to move over there? Or
Yeah, do you want
fine? That's fine, it's up to you.
Yeah, you sit here, because you're getting to the camera that way.
Use my paper notes. Right. That would be great. Hi everyone. So as you heard, my name is Tyrone Scott, Senior Movement Building and Activism Officer at War on Want. But I think you've seen that because that's been up there for the last 10 minutes, which is not intentional, but everyone's had a good look at my face. From when I used to be a bit more of a moustache enthusiast, but slightly moved on from there now. I'm not going to go into too much detail about War on Want in regards to what we do. It was a really good introduction there, so thank you so much. It's nicer than some of the introductions I often usually get. So what I'm going to speak about today, obviously, is about the corporate greed versus people need, and look to try and bring in the sort of global south perspectives and really look at it through the frame of the just transition that we need. I'm going to try and look at a few of the industries in which we work with and try my absolute best to keep this within the time limit, which I'm cautious about. So I'll try to do that. So yeah, as you know, corporate greed is, not only fueling climate breakdown, it is, I feel, the biggest driver of inequality, the biggest cause of poverty wages, and is why much of the world go to bed hungry every single night. It's capitalism and the endless pursuit of limitless growth, and this is what we need to transition away from. Now, our call for a just transition goes far beyond just energy. It's about wide-scale transformation and transformative system change to a new economic system based on people's need over corporate greed. Because for 500 years, the capitalist logic of exploiting people and extracting limitless amounts of the Earth's natural resources has fueled slavery, colonialism, and imperialism, creating a global economic system with the deepest of roots in racialized and gendered injustice. And this has embedded the idea that ecosystems and peoples in some part of the world can be sacrificed because they have less value than the lives in the global north. And this is often, it's down to the colonial powers such as the UK, and often driven by the UK, changed the economic systems in countries that they colonised, from producing food to feed local populations to producing cash crops for exports to meet the needs of European countries. Minerals were extensively mined and exported from colonised countries, with companies adopting cheap and forced labour from the very communities that have been forcibly removed from the land. And this extraction of resources and exploitation of labour continues to this day in the business models of so many of our major industries. And that's what I'm going to try and have a flash through of those industries today. And the urgency of the climate crisis has propelled debates on how we transition to greener ways of living. But for the transition of polluting industries to be sustainable and fair, it means looking at the whole business model. Oh, thanks, you're doing some slides for me there. I forgot I had the slides too. The whole business model. And there can't be justice in a future that puts the needs of workers and communities anywhere but the centre. And this is why the intentions behind a just transition must be rooted in global, purposeful solidarity between movements of workers and social and environmental movements. And any just transition must recognise and redress the harms already done through centuries of colonial-style enterprise that have stolen wealth, resources and labour from the global south. And this is where I'll look at the sort of three industries in particular, which is food, fashion and energy, and why it's all intrinsically linked, and it's the same issues and it's the same transition that we need. So yeah, got the first slide already there, which is great. And I think you've appointed yourself as my de facto clicker now, so thank you very much, Andy. So food, so today, despite unprecedented global wealth existing in the world, 1 in 7 people go to bed hungry. The corporate monopolies and governments that enable them have encouraged and brought forward a model of food production based on the solutions of the Green Revolution, which claimed that the main cause of hunger and malnutrition was the inability of small and medium-scale farmers to increase productivity. But the problem of hunger today is not a problem of scarcity of food or production. We produce enough calories to feed the world twice over. And on the next slide, there's a little graphic. But a problem of power imbalances is corporate concentration, increased inequality, and lack of access to resources. The current industrial food production system only produces about 30% of the world's food. But 75% of the global agricultural land is taken by agribusiness companies so they can export-oriented commodities like soy and maize, essentially for industrial meat production for animals to eat. Now this, as well as food additives that contribute to ultra-processed food industry and the global malnutrition and health crisis. And what we have, and is stated in our report, Profiting from Hunger, which I recommend everyone to have a look and read, and there'll be a QR code on the final slide at the end, so not yet, it's okay. But the decades of research and practice have proved that peasant farming is the only sort of method which really feeds the world. And smallholder peasant farmers are still using land far more efficiently. And if their methods were the methods that were applied more widely across the world's arable land, then they could grow a larger percentage of the world's food. But it's monopolized food industries that's concentrated through the corporations that won't allow that to happen, and the land grabs that have happened, that means that many peasant communities no longer have access to the land to be able to produce the food that their communities need. And of course, the world is also in the grip of a climate crisis, which is already and continuously having severe impacts, particularly and predominantly on countries across the global south, causing frequent and intense climate disasters. Oh, it's too far forward now, I'm afraid, sorry. Yeah, that's fine. I've only got a couple of slides for each. It's more just so there's something to look at. But the level of disruption to the global food production is one of the many challenges deeply connected to the climate crisis, and it illustrates how unsustainable our current global industrial food system is. So food sovereignty, communities taking back control of their food systems, is an alternative to the conventional approach of food security. It's a practical solution that respects people's right to food, ensures ecologically sustainable farming, and proposes an end to the corporate control of the global food system. And I very much encourage, because the time to get into everything on food sovereignty is difficult, to encourage to read the report on Profiting from Hunger and more around the work of our partners and what they do to reclaim control of their food systems. And our partners work on a grassroots level, mobilizing farmers, farm workers in their communities at a local, regional and national level, and at the same time conduct practical activities on the ground. So for an example, our partners in Kenya mobilized and trained more than 200 farmers in two counties on the production of alternative pesticides. They cultivated the ingredients, propagated the formula, and distributed organic pesticides on their fields. And with the scientific evidence and positive social and health impact of this work, they gathered enough information to build a stronger case against the unregulated import of highly hazardous pesticides that are banned in the US, banned in the UK, banned across most of Europe, but allowed into Kenya, again because of corporate lobbying that these pesticides must be used. And that was back to the aforementioned Green Revolution, when peasants were essentially kicked off much of their land so agribusiness could control the food production. The Green Revolution, in essence, was about enabling much pesticides that we see in our foods today to change the way we produce, to make it mass production and what they see as cheaper. But that was just an example with the Kenyans of the evidence-based advocacy work that our partners are conducting in their countries, which is based on their grassroots work. And this work is vital in order to bring forward the long-lasting change and just transition, a different model of food production, distribution and consumption to guarantee a dignified life for all. So that was a very quick flash into the food industry. So where we see these issues into fashion, and thank you very much. I'm sweating far too much here. It's quite hot and I'm speaking far too fast because I'm trying to get through 15 minutes.
Have some of my water.
May do. But the fashion industry, and these are all linked, and that's what I'm hopefully going to look to tie together. The fashion industry is an industry which is out of control. Oh, lovely. And out of control. And often the fashion industry is run with little regard to the climate and ecological impact, but even less regard to the human impact of the fashion industry. Because when we think of the pitfalls of the garment industry, there's many things to point to. It's the unsustainable mass production practices, the carbon cost of mass production, or the excessive amount of water and land it uses, or the estimation of 85% of textiles end up in the dump each year unused. But I don't really just want to speak about the ecological impact of any industry. It's also always the human cost of the mass-produced fashion inequality and, at the bottom line of it, corporate greed. And our report, and a little trend here, but reports and all the things I'm speaking about, but our report, Fashion in the Future, which again I really look to read if possible, looks to bridge that gap and bridge the polarized debate between environmental movements pushing for consumption to be reduced in response to the climate crisis and workers' rights advocates highlighting the poor labour conditions, unsafe working conditions, and what the issues around sort of the reduction of jobs would mean for the livelihoods of millions who have based all of their economies on the export-led trading models that we enforced in them in the first place. So what we look to try and do with that report is bridge that gap between them and argues that scaling back the extraction of Earth's resources and the production of new garments can and must happen while ensuring our societies are equipped for this transition. So global South countries and workers whose economies and jobs now depend on the fashion industry must not lose out when production is reduced. And right now, it's workers who are losing out already. So in Bangladesh, in the heart of the garment industry, and where many of our partners are, where most major fashion brands have some form of operations, is an example of how corporate profits is prioritized over the welfare of people, communities, and workers. So that's whether it was the Rana Plaza disaster, in which 11 years ago, on the 24th of April, an entirely preventable disaster where 1,138 garment workers were killed when the building housing 5 garment factories collapsed, and this was an absolutely no accident. So with this, and I apologize if you know about this already, but with the Rana Plaza disaster, multiple audits were carried out on that building by major fashion brands. Primark did 2 audits, one in the week of the collapse of that building. The workers in there were trying to refuse to go into work for the whole time, but were informed, if you don't come into work, you'll lose a month's pay. Obviously, workers can't risk that. They don't have the same worker protections that we have here in the UK, even though they are being taken away on a seemingly daily basis, and therefore they're forced to go into work. They went into work that day, and of course, that building collapsed and not only killed 1,138 workers, but trapped thousands more under the rubble and did more untold devastation. Now, this really is just a catastrophe that shows an industry that's completely out of control, where illegally constructed buildings crack under the weight of people and machinery, while fashion brands make millions in profits, where millions of impoverished women work as machine operators and garment quality inspectors, pressing shirts and snipping loose threads 6 days a week, while billionaires buy super yachts. So Rana Plaza was no accident and was entirely preventable. that there has been an improvement in conditions there. There was a Bangladeshi Accords and Safety and Fire. Most fashion brands signed that, although some haven't still. IKEA, Levi, Amazon, who are becoming one of the biggest sort of fashion suppliers nowadays, they refuse to sign any accords, but they have hugely improved conditions. But even with those accords, garment workers still face poverty wages and unsafe working conditions, and workers in fashion factories can expect to earn 2 to 5 times less than the amount needed to support a family. And just on the next slide, and sorry, but thank you again, they're not hugely relevant, it's just something in the background again, but the minimum wage for Bangladesh is set once every 5 years for the ready-made garment industry, which is already outrageous for a five-year change. So the minimum wage was previously around £60 a month, which is 8,000 taka, which is nowhere near enough to live on, of course, even in a lower cost of living place like Bangladesh. Now, since 2018, there's been a pandemic, severe economic crisis in Bangladesh, rising inflation, which has ramped up the cost of everything. So in 2018, 4 eggs was 12 taka. Today, it is 70 taka. And whilst wages have stagnated, which means meat, fish, and fruit have become luxuries that workers simply cannot afford. Now, trade unionists and workers were asking for that wage to be risen to £172 a month, as a minimum wage, which is still below the living wage for a family of 4 within Bangladesh. Now, that was rejected, of course. Pressure from factory owners, with brands complicit, government collusion, means that there was absolutely no chance of that happening. 1 minute, I've got to be really, really quick now. But yeah, with that, protests were raised, Bangladeshi workers were killed, and 40,000 arrest warrants are still outstanding now for Bangladeshi workers who have looked to try and fight back against poverty wages. And this is with the tacit approval of major high street bands that Bangladeshi garment workers are encountering systemic punishment and retaliation, violence, arrests, terminations, and killings. And this is all happening on the back of record profits. And the fashion industry is a driver of poverty, debt, and stark inequality, and also a major cause of ecological and climate crisis. So these social and environmental crimes have the same systemic causes, yet in some quarters, the debate is around how we change a fashion industry has become polarized between workers and planet. And environmental movements call for consumption to be drastically reduced, and people must buy better, while factory jobs are written off as dull, dangerous, and short-term. While economic justice and workers' rights movement highlight that this reduction on people, communities, and national economies across the global south, millions of job losses, and this is undermining the fight for working conditions. And this is why these fights have to be united. And this was going to bring me into energy, but I think we're running out of time very, very quickly. But it's just around...
You could bring energy if you wanted to. I mean, take another minute, but if you wanted to give it more justice, you could do it later on, maybe?
Yeah, do it in the closing. We'll let the other 2 key speakers come in. So we'll come into that with the further steps. But really, the key thing we wanted to get across really is whether it's food, whether it's fashion, whether it is energy and fossil fuel dependency, the transitioning away from from the major polluting elements of these industries is not simply enough. We can't transition away from fossil fuels, but continue an economy that puts workers at the bottom, that puts communities at the bottom. If we're looking to move away from fossil fuels and extract new materials, that can't be done again from extracting limitless materials from the global south, turning more countries into sacrifice zones. With the fashion industry, we can't just reduce consumption without thinking about the impact on workers, where Bangladesh, for example, has based the whole economy on exporting garment workers. And when it comes to food, again, it's not about simply reducing the consumption. Again, it's about redistributing that power back into the hands of the peasant farmers and workers who have figured out the techniques to be able to do that at a low cost environmentally, socially, and fiscally as well. So, yeah, try to get too much in one. That's it. Thanks.
Thank you, Tyrone. And I think trying to even begin these subjects, and even 15 minutes is a relatively privileged amount of time, but even so, there are so many areas that could be looked at. So I hope you don't feel thwarted by it. But it was really useful insight into some really key industries and how the greed is playing out and how it's affecting people globally. I'm going to move on now to Andy. Andy Higginbottom. is a retired associate professor. He worked at Kingston University in London. I didn't know where Kingston was, or even if it's called Kingston, but it's in London. His research interest was critiquing the imperialism of the extractive industries, and also reinterpreting Marx's Capital and to make it relevant to contemporary capitalism, which is something that we're really interested in trying to do at the moment. He regularly publishes in journals such as Monthly Review, but Andy's more than an academic. An academic is good, but he's more than an academic. He's also a really fearsome activist. Has worked on many campaigns with many really important organisations such as London Mining Network, raised in really important issues of workers' rights such as the Marikana mining atrocity in South Africa, which I think was 2012, works for the Columbia Solidarity Campaign, so has a very wide reach. So we're extremely lucky to be able to learn from someone who has both that academic and that activist background. So over to you, Andy.
Well, we'll see just how lucky you are. So this is Mirage. I guess you know what that looks like. I mean, you've actually seen it. That was the image I used to write about COP28 before it actually took place, which is the promise that capitalism can solve the planetary crisis which it's plunged the world into. And I have to say, after COP28, things did not get any better. COP28 itself was quite outrageous in terms of hijacking the agenda. I mean, the two forces which came out of it very happily were the United States and the oil-rich countries of the Gulf. There was a claim made that because for the first time, this is COP28 by the way, 28 years in, for the first time fossil fuels was actually in a statement, right? It took 28 years to get that far, right? Let alone do anything, right? But in actual fact, the capitalist powers that be weren't too upset by that, because there was a very important qualifying word that any transition away from fossil fuels would be in an orderly way. And that's big code. It means we will not touch profits and empire. It will be orderly, okay? One big argument, and I'm going to introduce some of the arguments which I think need debating. One of the major authorities, and you probably remember, you probably saw a lot of these reports with curves about reducing fossil fuels and how do we keep within 1.5 or 2 or 3 degrees, right? The IEA is a major publisher of these reports, and it's got quite a strong sort of, it's an influencer of this debate. And basically it's arguing that there has already been the beginning of an economic paradigm shift, which is because renewables are now cheaper to produce energy than fossil fuels. That's their argument, okay? They're saying that this is actually means that it'd be irrational not to, even on a, if you like, a capitalistic basis. I mean, what's the problem? It'd just be like vested interest or feudal shapes or something getting in the way. The bubble was pricked within COP28 itself by this guy called Ray Dalio, who I'd never heard of, but apparently he's the head of the world's biggest hedge fund, right? And he said, there's just one thing. You've got to guarantee if we invest in renewables, we're going to make an economic return. Just one small detail, okay? It turns out that of the trillions available from private capital, he estimated you'd need about 5 to 10 trillion to carry out this transition from one type of energy to another. And he actually says only 0.3% of current private investment is headed in that direction, right? So it's not 10 times less, it's not 100 times less, It's 1,000 times less than what would need to happen of a transition away from fossil fuels on a capitalist basis. Okay. If you think that was bad, it's got worse. Okay, and I think if you read The Guardian, or if you live in the world, you probably know this. In actual fact, 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels has already been surpassed. We're already past it. I don't know why they're managing the message. All of a sudden, oh, it wasn't just 1.5 degrees past which set off alarms. It has to be sustained over a decade. Okay? Well, for the average temperature over the last year, we've been 1.58 degrees at a world level. And that's an average. So, I mean, some parts of the world are now 3-4 degrees above pre-industrial levels. The ocean is at about 0.8 degrees above pre-industrial levels and so on. It got worse because after COP28, there's been an expansion of oil and gas production. The Texas shale, Exxon and Chevron are buying in to Texas big time. There's been major expansion plans by BP and Shell. BP repositioned itself. It said, you know, we will look at renewables. They've done twice now. They've done a U-turn on that. They're looking once again to expand their production of gas and oil. And again, I think you know this. We only need to follow the news to know this. It's got worse again in terms of the politics of the UK, expanding new fields in the North Sea. I've already mentioned fracking. The big expansion globally is off the coast of the Americas and off the coast of Africa. Oil exploration has gone deep into the ocean. So the biggest environmental impacts, the biggest unknowns, the unknowns just get bigger and bigger. And for example, if there's an oil spill off the coast of Guyana, where Exxon's got a massive field now, right, it would affect the ocean all around the Caribbean, for example. Okay. So what we've got is a doubling down of the establishment is backing as you go, not just as you go, but even more. That's the political reality which we're living in. They're actually stepping away from the rather puny and long distance. It's a bit like millennial development goals. You know, they'll never come. It's just like fine words to keep people happy, right? Net zero in 2050 without an actual plan in the next 5 years is of the same character, right? It's just something for the gullible to run away with and say, look, we've got something, you know. Actually, even that they're resiring on, they're pulling back from, right? And it's not just the Tory government, it's also the Labour Party, it's also the Scottish government actually on this particular point. And at the same time, they are increasingly criminalising the protesters who are trying to save the planet. Okay? Just Stop Oil, but it's not only Just Stop Oil, Fossil Free London, XR, so on and so forth. You know, the changing of the law to make it a crime to walk along the street slowly, it has come about. Actually, the police in London last week decided that blue was criminal, and they arrested people for holding a banner which had too much blue on it. So, you know, that's the country we're living in. It's not only the state. I have to say, this is a big, deep problem in British society. I mean, there was a revolt against ULEV. I mean, okay, so these people are not power deciders, but they're part of the population. And people do want to stick to their cars and so on. So that was taken advantage of, but it's a real issue, okay? How far people are prepared to change our lifestyles in order to save the planet is actually part of the discussion, right? Now, this is from the Financial Times just this week. It's just on the finance side. You can't probably see this very well. This is how much is being invested to transition away from fossil fuels. This is how much the Financial Times experts say isn't required, right? You know, once again, it's not just one order of magnitude, it's 2 orders of magnitude away from reality. There's far more being invested in arms, etc. Now, UK fits into this picture in a very particular way, okay? And we've already heard of it from, already, you know, we get a sense of this, right? This is from the market capitalisation of the top 20 companies in the UK. And the UK economy is the most multinational dominated you could think of, right? It's the most extractivist economy probably in the world. It's the most imperialist economy in the world, in the sense that 80% of the revenue of the top 100, not the Financial Times, the LSE top 100, right, comes from abroad. 80% of the revenue, which probably means more than 80% of the profits of the big companies in this country, come from abroad. They're based on the exploitation of people abroad, 4 times more than exploitation of people in this country. Okay, so that's the character of the dominant players in the British economic establishment. And this is a breakdown. We've heard about food already. We've got 5 huge food multinationals. We've got 2 massive, Global Justice now have written a campaign on the pharmaceuticals, 2 massive pharmaceuticals, finance, not a big surprise, mining, oil. Okay, if you add those up, nearly 90% of this sort of dominant group based on extractivism from elsewhere around the world, right? Not stuff largely produced here. Pharmaceuticals argue a little bit, but all the rest completely so. George Monbiot used this term, which I think deserves repetition: planetary death machines. It is said that the UK is responsible for 1.1% of global CO2 equivalent emissions. Okay, that's the figure which is often quoted. In actual fact, it's been going down. It has been going down since the 1990s because we're not burning so much coal, basically. Now, look on the left-hand side, and what you see is what these different mega corporations are responsible for in terms of what they produce, especially oil and mining. Okay, that data is slightly outdated, and it will be a bit lower. But you just look at the figures if it's clear enough, right? 383 megatons produced by all domestic, all industry emissions in the UK, you know, in the territory of the UK. 383 megatons, right? About 5 times more than that is produced by what these multinationals produce globally. Very often they operate in, you know, dozens of countries around the world. Okay? If you added on the emissions from imports, you would double our 1.1%. But if you add on this character of extractivism around the world, the UK is actually responsible for about UK capitalism, I have to say, right, is responsible for about 7.5% of all global CO2 emissions. Go figure. Right, now we come to some debate. One of the NGOs working in this field, actually it was an offshoot of that data. It's called, what they call the carbon tracker, that's right. They produce reports and so on. And some of the reports are good, okay? I mean, for example, they're explaining exactly the problem with the CO2 recovery industry, which is a bit of a mirage in and of itself, okay? But their main argument is this. Their main argument, they're trying to lobby green finance. They're saying it's not a wise investment decision to put your money in fossil fuels, because 10, 15 years down the line, those assets will be stranded and will be no longer profitable, right? Okay. So they're saying that this is a risk to states and investors to keep in fossil fuels. It's an appeal to enlightened self-interest of finance. Okay. If you remember, Carney, the Canadian ex-chair of the Bank of England, was pushing this line about 2 or 3 years ago, right? Enlightened self-interest, green finance. What I've just shown you, and this book by Brett Christophers explains in a lot more detail, is just not true, right? The profitability is the essential thing. If they don't get a return, they don't invest, right? And 5 to 7% is not the same as 15% plus, and that is still the situation. So it's very basic, very arithmetic, but that's the way the system works. The reason it works this way is you'll have got 1 minute left. So you'll have to read Karl Marx's theory of rent. And this is not, I mean, I'm not saying this theory just to be clever. You have to understand the system destroys nature by appropriating the most, cherry picking in effect, the most advantageous parts of it. And those most advantageous parts are fought over by capital, because once you've got control of it, once you have a monopoly over it, it's a license to print money basically, because it's a gift of nature. You don't have to put a lot of workers or a lot of capital in, and you know, depending on where you are in the world, your costs of production are much lower than the actual price on the market. And this is a diagram from Marx, and you see he was talking about agricultural production and wheat, and you have one producer can produce a quarter of the cost of the marginal producer, if you like, right? Which means that 3/4 of their selling price is profit. So Marx is explaining surplus profits, he called it. We might call it super profits or monopoly profits today, right? Massive profits are available to the low-cost energy producers. And this is called an industrial production curve. It's actually almost the same as what Marx is writing about in Volume 3 of Capital, right? And you can see where the cheaper producers are, the middle, and the marginal producers are. And you just think of the volume and the price to cost margin, and you can see how much fantastic amounts of money is being made from this industry, right? So it's not just the marginal profit that matters, it's the average profit taken into account all these very low cost producers. So the degree of variation along this curve matters. If they were all producing at $60 a barrel, then you wouldn't get this variation. But some producers can produce at just $10 a barrel, which means if you're selling at $80 or $90, you know, it's, again, the arithmetic is very obvious, right? The question is, why is it happening and what's its significance? Its significance is this, that whoever controls the Gulf region controls the world, pretty much, right? And there are all kinds of doctrines of US policy, one of which is don't let anybody else get control of the Gulf, right? Okay, that's known as, I think that's the Wolfowitz doctrine, if I remember right, okay, right? Nearly 20% of the world's oil supplies go through the Straits of Hormuz, which is that little strait between Iran and Oman, okay? Britain's got bases there. Britain's friendly with all these Gulf states. The royal family race horses with them and, you know, drink, you know, have Sunday jokes with them and so on and so forth, right? It's not an accident, right? It's about using that royal privilege to keep in with the control of the strategic part of the world. So the military is completely connected. Why have we got aircraft carriers? We've got 2 aircraft carriers. Why have we got them? It's because they need to go to these parts of the world to make sure they don't fall into the wrong hands. My last slide, I think, is this, right? It's not just about the adjectives, it's about capitalism as such. The problem really is systemic. We're into a phase of politics now where, you know, muck and mend won't do. We need to talk openly about the need for a real revolution to save the planet.
So thank you, Andy. There's a huge amount in there, and I don't know, I'd be really interested to get one of your PowerPoints actually on that, coming up with that 7.5% to follow the logic through, because it was a really interesting figure, because we are permanently being confronted by the notion of what about China, what about India, and you kind of look at historical emissions, but having that sort of like lucidity of information, 7.5% is really significant. Really significant. 1.1% is actually significant for a small country like Britain, but it's a really interesting figure, so thanks very much. We're going to move on now, and I'm going to introduce Daisy. Daisy works with Global Justice now, and I'll come back to that in a moment, but that's obviously close to our hearts here, Global Justice Sheffield putting on the event. I actually knew Daisy for a number of years. We worked together on a small campaign which was actually trying to look at how do you link the climate emergency with the issues of global justice, with the issues of debt justice, reparations, things which are really important for the countries of the global south, but also really important for working people here. So we formed a group together. Daisy was really involved in that. She also has been a fearless campaigner on environmental justice issues, has worked with Extinction Rebellion with a number of really good interventions. She did a master's degree in graphics communication design. I don't know what university, I wouldn't know where it was, but another London one. And considered issues of how do you communicate complexity and intersectionality when you're talking about climate. She then got appointed to Global Justice Now, and in her current job she's campaigns and activism officer, and in that role has done many things, but one which I highlight is to write into a report called Taken Not Earned, which has been set up to look at how monopolies what the role of monopolies are in the global wealth and power divide. And I'm sure that experience is going to offer a lot tonight. So thank you, Daisy.
Thank you, Sarah.
You've got 15 minutes.
Thank you. Yeah, so as I said, I'm going to talk about monopolies broadly, and monopolies being a very kind of specific contemporary characteristic of modern capitalism, but also kind of corporate power. And then I'm going to look at energy monopolies in particular, and because it's so significant for the climate crisis. And then I'm going to end on hopefully something tangible and a bit hopeful and solution focused about what we can do to challenge these monopolies. It's probably not escaped anyone's notice there's been a massive increase in billionaire wealth in recent years. There are now 2,781 billionaires, which is an increase of 141 just in the last year. That's the biggest increase we've ever seen. Billionaire wealth is growing as a proportion of global wealth. The combined assets of those 2,781 people total $14.2 trillion. That's a $2 trillion increase just in 2023. And that's more than the GDP of every single country combined in the world except for the USA and China. That's huge. Their collective wealth has risen 120% in the last decade, at the same time as millions of people across the world, billions of people are experiencing the cost of living crisis and seeing their living standards decrease as a result of that. It's not a coincidence that massive upsurge in billionaire wealth has occurred at the same time as the cost of living crisis and a global pandemic. These disasters have facilitated a massive wealth transfer from the poor to the mega rich. The UK government gave out £700 billion in economic support in COVID. That should have been about an average of £16,000 per person. Did anyone see £16,000 of government support? No. It pretty much all got sucked up by bailing out massive corporations. That was one of the ways in which, as everybody else was getting poorer, these massive corporations are getting much, much richer. The sector that saw the most growth during the pandemic was luxury goods. I feel like that says a lot. When everyone else is struggling with a pandemic and a cost of living crisis and your living standards are going down, the things that the rich are spending money on are luxury items because they've suddenly got so much more money they can afford to buy all their new super yachts. Bernard Arnault is the world's richest man, and he's the CEO of LVMH, Louis Vuitton, Moet Hennessy, one of the biggest luxury goods companies in the world. The fact that he is currently the world's richest man, I think, says a lot about the size of that sector. Inequality, and lots of people on the right will tell you this, that inequality between countries has actually reduced in recent years, but inequality within countries has massively increased as the vast majority of people get poorer and a very few people at the top get much, much richer. So where's this money come from, and why is billionaire growth growing overall as a proportion of overall wealth? The world's wealthiest billionaires all have the secret that's hiding in plain sight, which is the vast majority of them are monopolists. There's a huge overlap between the 20 richest people in the world and the CEOs of the 20 richest companies in the world. These people have accumulated wealth through industries that are so dominant and influential that they can leverage their power to suck wealth out of the general economy. This also gives them huge power and influence over the decisions that affect our everyday lives, which has terrible consequences for democracy. The mega rich are involved in writing a lot of the rules of the global economy that then lock their profits in place. And we've heard about some of these already. I mentioned ISDS earlier. So ISDS is a mechanism within trade deals. We refer to it as corporate courts that allow corporations to sue governments for making decisions that are often democratically motivated that impact their profits. We see this a lot with fossil fuel corporations suing governments when they make changes towards climate action. We've also got massive subsidies for polluting industries like fossil fuels, agriculture and aviation. We've got hugely outsized and unregulated finance sector that's leeching wealth from ordinary people and driving up prices through speculation on basic commodities like food and energy. Thanks to lobbying and a kind of sense of a neutralization of business interests in our economy and a revolving door actually between a lot of our kind of political institutions and key CEOs or key kind of like presidents of big business industries. We've got this normalization of corporate interests in a lot of our kind of democratic decision-making processes. This is particularly big actually if you look at like the revolving door between fossil fuel companies and elected representatives in the US. It's absolutely huge. I'm going to talk about some of the tools and tricks that monopolists use to gain, hide, and then reinforce their power. One of the biggest ones is mergers and acquisitions. So corporate concentration is massively growing in recent years. Big tech, so one of the richest sectors of the economy, the 5 biggest firms, Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and Microsoft, have bought out over 1,000 companies in the last 2 decades. You actually see this in every single sector. You see a massive reduction in the number of corporations that are controlling significant sectors of that economy. So a massive condensation of how few companies control this massive amount of power. One example from agriculture is that 25 years ago you had 10 corporations controlling 40% of the global seed market. Now it's just 2. And in pharmaceuticals, where 20 years ago, actually it's 1995 to 2015, so in a 20-year gap, you moved from there being 60 pharmaceutical companies dominating the industry to just 10. So all of these big corporations are kind of hoovering up the smaller ones. You also get kind of diversification and horizontal integration within monopoly corporations, which allows them to kind of completely destroy competition. We see a lot of corporations that are so big and so diversified that they're able to operate at a massive loss initially to be able to kill off all of their competition. So Uber famously operated at a loss for about 7 years before finally turning a profit. Amazon make a massive loss on a lot of their retail platform, but their money doesn't come from their retail platform, it comes from Amazon Web Services, so they can afford to make a loss in their retail and drive out all of these other smaller businesses because they're making massive profits elsewhere. This also then leads to something that Cory Doctorow has coined choke point capitalism, where corporations not just kind of operate kind of horizontally, so across lots of different sectors, but they also operate vertically. They buy up every different stage of a production process. Amazon are really famous for doing this, like everything from, you know, the growing the food to the supermarkets at the end, every single aspect of that chain, which means that they can maximize their profits by, I've forgotten the word, anyway, maximizing their profits, but also squeezing suppliers at the bottom, squeezing consumers at the top. And because they're so dominant, you know, in something like the food system, you've got maybe 1 billion people producing food at one end, billions of people buying the food at the other end, but just a handful of corporations in the middle that are processing and delivering that food. And because there's so few of them, everyone's got to pass through. So they can afford to set really high fees. They buy the food at really, really low cost, and they sell it on for really high cost, and they get all of the profits. The problem with this is the more that people get locked in, so the more that all of the consumers are there, the more that the suppliers have nowhere else to go. So it just becomes a cycle of reinforcing power. In the food example, you get, you know, a lot of people are making masses of money out of food, but actually food producers only get about 8% of the £250 billion a year that we spend on food. In terms of high prices, one of the particularly unique things about these massive monopoly corporations, and something that we covered a lot in the report that Si mentioned, Taken Not Earned, was the fact that the biggest corporations have markups of about double what smaller corporations have. That means that they mark up their prices, which is your profit margin, by double what smaller corporations are. So they're often adding about 50% of the overall price on, whereas smaller corporations are more like 25%. So it is just wealth extraction. A lot of these big monopoly companies are also then famous for, tax evasion and things like that. So there's kind of further hiding of the way of this kind of massive amount of wealth that they've had, and a complete minimalisation of what they feed back into the system. This is partly kind of now moving on to harms and impacts, but again, it is actually another tactic for making money. It's like huge amounts of circumventing labour and environmental regulations. So we've obviously seen like huge mistreatment of workers, no responsibility or accountability for environmental damage whatsoever. If companies do get taken up on it, they can probably afford to pay really minimal fees, but then also because of this revolving door policy with democratic institutions, they're not being held accountable. This is quite a change from traditional capitalism. So even if you believe in capitalism, even if you're somebody who's written a book that says capitalism can fix the world, this is so far removed from the kind of capitalism that is taught in schools. There is no healthy competition. These corporations are defeating any opportunity to be challenged on that. Basically, these monopoly corporations are wealth extraction machines, squeezing suppliers, overcharging consumers, evading tax, exploiting workers, destroying the environment, and funneling the money into the pockets or tax havens of billionaires. The title of the report is called Taken Not Earned, because this money is taken and it is destroying society and the planet along the way. I'm going to talk a little bit now about energy monopolies in particular, which is especially important to focus on given the context of the climate crisis. Monopoly power in our energy sector will lead to climate catastrophe. But there's also some really clear and concrete things that we can do about this, and a particular campaign that I want to talk about. So we're used to headlines about insane fossil fuel profits at this stage. That's been the general narrative of the last couple of years with the cost of living crisis and the climate crisis, and meanwhile fossil fuel companies pocketing billions. Again, there's been a massive wealth transfer. Global Witness did some research that said that EU and USA oil and gas majors made $250 billion in profit in the 2 years since the Russian invasion. Despite making absolutely record gains in 2022, thanks to these soaring energy prices, the big five energy companies then only paid their shareholders an unprecedented $111 billion in 2023, instead of putting that money back into any sort of energy transition that we desperately need, as Tyrone's talked about. 2023 was obviously the hottest year on record, and yet this figure is 158 times what was pledged to vulnerable nations at last year's COP28 summit. 89% of people, so recent surveys said that 89% of people globally want to see more political action on climate change. So why do fossil fuel companies still have such a stranglehold on our economy, and how do we weaken their grasp? For the energy sector, more than 2/3 of all energy that was produced, more than 2/3 of all energy is produced by the largest 6 companies. So we've got that same concentration of corporations within the energy sector. In 2021, as a result of the shocks from COVID, dozens of smaller energy companies failed, further concentrating energy markets. For the energy sector, this isn't actually a new thing. Monopolistic practices have been really common since the very beginning. Almost a century ago, there was a really controversial meeting between the CEOs of what are now some of the biggest fossil fuel companies, so BP, Shell, ExxonMobil and Chevron, met in secret, supposedly to do some grouse hunting, and actually they were negotiating a price-fixing deal, which is an illegal cartel, which was illegal then and is illegal now. But cooperation means power. these corporations, because they and it is really, really normal for them to band together to push back against. Oh wow, that went quickly. It's really normal for these corporations to push back against any kind of regulation and power. I'm going to do, I guess, a whistle-stop tour then through some of my other points, which is I wanted to talk about Charles Koch, particularly. Charles Koch is one of the richest people in the world. He is 25th on the billionaire list. His sister, Julia Koch, is 23rd. Together, they own Koch Industries, which is one of the biggest fossil fuel producing companies in the world. They specifically and really explicitly gear their business around expanding exclusively into markets that are uncompetitive and face basically no competition because they're monopolistic firms. They then use their profits to fund all sorts of libertarian causes. They fight government, all kinds of central planning, they attack taxes, they defeat trade unions, and really significantly, they fund initiatives that fight climate action and proliferate climate denialism. And it's not even misinformation, it's disinformation. It's intentionally wrong information about the climate. Fossil fuels are by far the largest contributor to climate change, but in COP28 we had a record 2,456 representatives from the fossil fuel industry. That is fossil fuel lobbying on a scale that we've never seen before. And it was far more than the 10 most vulnerable countries to climate change had in terms of their representation. Okay, really quick then, what can we do about this? One campaign that I would like to talk about is, sorry, I'm going over. Climate change is one of the most urgent and visible symptoms of a vast and accelerating power and wealth divide. As a result, there are already massive global movements in place challenging this. We do need global coordination to fight the climate crisis and to beat fossil fuel companies' delaying tactics. This is why a campaign for a fossil fuel treaty is gaining momentum, because it's a perfect vehicle to take the fossil fuel industry head on. It's talking about supply, like limiting supply, not just demand. And it's a Global South-led campaign, and I'm just going to really briefly. It's a Global South campaign. It's basically a global exit plan for fossil fuels. It's got 3 pillars. We need non-proliferation. We need to stop, end the expansion of coal, oil and gas production. We need a fair phase out of the existing supply, and we need a just transition towards a renewable energy sector. If we can learn anything from monopolies, it's that a collective is a million times stronger than the sum of its parts. The movement for a fossil fuel treaty is growing in front of our eyes, and if we work together as a movement and demand our governments push back against the monopolists, then we can end fossil fuels and build a sustainable economy in which wealth and power are fairly shared. Yeah, another world is possible. Thank you.
Thank you. So, that was a really detailed and the amount of information that you gave there, Daisy, was really, really helpful. I particularly like the way in which you drew reference to the ISDS and just how unfair that system is. A system which you have corporations who have courts, where the actual organisation has its settlement component of the part within the World Bank, and when you try to find it, even the people in the World Bank don't know where it is, but there is a corridor on which it exists, and they do these things. And if you want to know how dreadful it is, when apartheid in South Africa was finally overthrown, the Italian firm, we don't like the notion that there's going to be some redistribution of the wealth that was accumulated through apartheid to the majority black population. They didn't like it, so they used ISDS against it. Might be worth looking at that. But that's the kind of skullduggery which corporate greed will go to, and which it's got its structures and its institutions which it will use. So yeah, I think planetary death machines is quite an apt term, and could be a comment. Right, so I want to open up this discussion to the floor. I want people to ask questions, make comments, get clarification, whatever, and to look at what are we going to do about this situation. What could we do about this situation? How do we feel? How do we feel we are in the campaign to create a transformed future?
Right,
I'll
we can go
kick
ahead.
off with just a question of facts. I think to Andy, your figure of 7.5% UK responsibility for the fossil fuels, that's up for the carbon pollution. Am I right in thinking that still doesn't include the way in which we've exported our carbon-rich production, carbon-heavy production to other countries, so that this is calculated from what goes up the chimney within our geographical border. It doesn't look at all the carbon that's locked into the stuff that we buy from abroad now, which used to be, we used to produce it and that was our carbon, part of our carbon output. But now we have exported it, a lot of it to China. And is that a factor in those figures? Does it add to the 7.5%?
Should we take a few things to begin with so the audience get a bit of an opportunity? There's a carbon accountancy question there for you, Andy. Person, did you have your hand up?
Well, I did want to ask a question, because somebody recently said sustainable aviation. Is there such a thing, or what is it?
That's a good question. I'll put that down. Lady there.
I just wanted to ask Tyrone why Amazon and IKEA didn't want to sign that, and others did. And what were they signing?
And the gentleman just here.
I just want to know how the Chinese fit into this picture, since they're not, well, not supposed to be a capitalist system. I was listening to a podcast today that was saying that Biden has slapped 100% tariff on electric vehicles and batteries, and the Chinese are producing loads. The thrust of the podcast was that the Chinese will leave the Americans behind in developing technology. So I just wonder how that works in terms of the climate.
So I've got 4 questions. I think that's a start. And give Andy the first one, which was on carbon accountancy. And Tyrone, I think you were asked directly about Amazon and IKEA.
Okay, so I did it quite quick just because of the time pressure. So there are 3 categories that make up that 7.5%. Okay. So one is the emissions of businesses and homes in the UK, right? And you're quite right to identify it. And in fact, there is a government report. The last one I saw was 2019, when they do an estimate of the amount of, they call it carbon footprint, of our imports, basically. And of course, Britain manufactures much less than it consumes. Mostly comes from China, and we mostly export finance and services and so on, right? So there are some manufacturing exports, but the net is a massive inflow of sort of material production, which carries a carbon footprint, right? And the report I read actually just this week says it's nearly double. I mean, you know, it's huge. You could just double the UK's emissions if you add in the effect of the emissions to produce the imports which we consume. I mean, I've seen another figure which said 1.5, another report. You know, these are estimates, so it's in that ballpark. So that would take it up from 380 to 700, say. Yeah, so it's an issue. And of course, you know, it's when you look at the concentration of corporate power and the type of corporations, it also illuminates for me an awful lot of issues, right? Including things like Brexit, you know, in terms of, you know, did they really care that much? big business, right? Because they just keep on going. You know, the world is their oyster in effect, right? And they just keep exploiting all over the world, or mostly all over the global south, right? Yeah, so the big figure is the carbon emissions from their own production under foreign direct investment overseas, which is the big number.
Tyrone, would you like to come in on Amazon and IKEA?
Yeah. I mean, I don't want to make it too simplistic, I guess, with Amazon and IKEA and why they're not signing the accords, but it's simply because they can get away with it. You know, when the Rana Plaza factory collapsed 11 years ago now, there was 29 sort of fashion brands that were found or easily identified to be manufacturing clothes within the factory, and at that point, they weren't the ones who were identified. And I think as well, you know, IKEA and Amazon aren't widely known or seen or perceived to be garment production corporations or companies, which means they don't get as much pressure from the consumers as some of the big brands do. And within that immediate 12 months, especially 6 months from the Rana Plaza disaster, there was so much sort of exertion of pressure put against these global brands from consumers, which unfortunately that's what they have to do, listen to from consumers, as well as campaign groups and activists and trade unionists, but consumers in particular saying, I don't want to be associated with, you know, the clothing that's been produced in a place that's killed so many workers. Whereas that pressure does not exist right now on the consumers with Amazon and with IKEA currently, and it's how we are able to potentially do that or find other ways to get them to sign the accords. But even within the accords themselves, you know, the time that's passed, there's still people who find them woefully inadequate. They don't really take into account, you know, the dangerous overtime hours people have to do to plug the gap between, you know, the lack of living wage, which means that machinery becomes much more dangerous and people haven't slept in a certain amount of times. There's still accidents within Bangladeshi garment factories, even with the accords. We're finding factory owners being able to get away still with not meeting all of those requirements and standards. So there's a school of thought of, yes, they're not signing those accords and it's awful, and it's a good way to expose how bad, especially IKEA. You know, I mean, Amazon, they almost just revel in how they're bad, everyone knows they're bad, whatever. You know, and it's terrible, but they can almost get away. Everyone knows they exploit labour, everyone knows even within the UK, you know, everyone knows they exploit labour across the world, everyone knows they do environmental destruction, they avoid their tax. But it's Amazon, they're going to grow exponentially either way. So maybe there's exerting more pressure on IKEA potentially, I don't think Amazon are going to care. But either way, is it the accord we want people to sign now? Maybe it was 10 years ago, or we're trying to push brands generally into looking at no more exploiting labour, better conditions, no more environmental destruction and everything. So, but yeah, simplistically, because they can get away with it, especially Amazon, yeah, unfortunately.
I might have a stab at sustainable aviation for you. On the basis that I've recently sat on the South Yorkshire Citizens' Assembly, which I don't know if people were aware of. It was a Citizens' Assembly for climate change. And one of the recommendations which came out of that assembly was for the reopening of the Doncaster Airport, which appears, because it is, in my opinion, very contradictory for the notion of how you address the climate change, climate emergency. How was that achieved? Well, one way in which it was achieved was the notion that there's such a thing as sustainable aviation. What could sustainable aviation mean for our local community? It could be introducing, trying to recruit Boeing to the Advanced Manufacturing Research Centre up the Parkway. Boeing have got an interest in wing technology, carbon fibre wing technology, which will reduce the amount of drag on the wings, and you get less fuel, so you're using less fuel, so that looks like a positive. They will talk about sustainable air fuels, which will look like a positive. They might be biofuels and so on. All of these things come at the cost of land. Land largely taken from people in global south countries to grow the commodity crop to grow these fuels. And the amount of carbon that's being pumped into the atmosphere is not significantly less. It's just in a different form. It's not the locked up carbon, which is from fossil fuels. How was it sold? It was also sold through the idea that we landscape around the airport and we put trees up, as if that is really going to make a great difference to what that aircraft is doing. And the amount of power which an aircraft delivers, in order to be able to put 350 people into it and take it off to the Canary Islands or New York or wherever, is absolutely vast. We have no comprehension of what is required to produce that amount of thrust. Okay, so there's all of those things which stand against it. The Climate Change Commission were very clear. Airport expansion has got to stop. If there's going to be any airport expansion, it requires a report to be done on existing capacity everywhere else. So when you have a citizens' assembly which is about informed and deliberative consent and democracy, you need to present that information. If you don't present that information and you only present this notion of sustainable aviation, you get a very skewed result, and I think that's what occurred. So my answer to you would be that when the vast majority of the population of the world have never ever been on an aircraft, and the very richest people take up almost 70% of all flights, then really we should be looking at how you deal with transport as a whole, what you put in, what other forms of transport you promote before you start trying to expand air flight further, which is what they're trying to do. It's another form of greenwashing.
I completely agree with everything you've said, and I think absolutely it's smacks of another conversation which is being led by the corporations that stand to profit from these existing industries, and I think it's a complete pipe dream. It's like carbon capture and storage. It's another one of these narratives that says it's okay, we don't have to change anything, we can just invent all these solutions, none of which are tested or proven. And I think it has a really dangerous consequence, because it does convince people that we might be able to just continue without changing anything. And it distracts from the real conversations that are starting, as Sai said, rather than starting from the conversation of we profit a lot from this industry and we want to be able to continue it. You need to start from the conversation of, well, actually the scientists are saying this can't happen, it physically can't happen, we do need to be scaling back, so how do we do that? And you start with the kind of the tangible facts rather than this desirable, we'd love to be able to continue living exactly as we are. I had something else to say, but I've forgotten it.
I'm going to take another question, or some more questions. We still got China, and I think the audience can answer China as well, because China is a really important thing to be able to wrestle with.
I can say something quick on China.
Do you want to do China quickly?
Which is, I don't know loads about the sort of Chinese economy, to be honest. What I do know is they get a lot of kind of good news of, oh, look what China are doing. They're massively expanding their renewables capacity, but they're also massively expanding their fossil fuel capacity. They're building more coal-fired power plants than any other country, even proportional to their population. Overall, it's a massive increase in energy consumption, which is led by a massive sort of industrial revolution. So I think, again, that leads into that conversation of we need to be slimming down. We need to be degrowing those damaging sectors of the economy that are producing those emissions. That said, China is also often used as a distraction technique for people, particularly in the West, in the UK and in the USA, to say, oh, we don't have to worry about that. We're not as bad as China. China is so much worse than us. They're producing so many more emissions. Why do we have to do anything? And I think that comes down to what Andy was talking about earlier, that here in the UK, we're responsible for a vastly disproportionate amount of historic emissions, having started the whole industrial revolution process many, many years ago. So yeah, don't let China be that kind of distraction technique to stop us focusing on what we can be responsible for here.
So I'm going to take Paul, then this gentleman, then John, and then this lady. That's four. Next
Just
four.
wanted to ask Tyrone about Bangladeshi factories, fashion factories. Some years ago there was a big issue about child labour in Bangladesh. Has that situation changed? How does that contribute to the general problem of exploitation?
Thank you. Paul.
Can we talk about Joe Public? Now, it's not an easy thing to do because it's a bit presumptuous, and I have no research to draw from. But broadly speaking, in, say, the UK and other Western countries, people recognise that there is global warming, right? There may be a few nutters who say, no, it isn't, etc., but we don't believe them because we have the evidence. There are yet another group of people who've really got worked up by this and are doing all kinds of mad things, like stopping motorways functioning and doing lots of other antisocial things, which we don't really approve of, because that's not the way we do things in the UK, because we're all pretty reasonable beings, aren't we? We think really it's the job of governments, but we don't understand enough about the relative merits of the different programs they are presenting and how important each party feels this is. Yes, we know about the Greens, and there are another lot of question mark people, aren't they, even though they've done pretty well in Sheffield in the recent local elections. We don't know about these corporations. We don't know about corporate greed. That penny has not dropped. And we do not know what strategies to employ that can bring about change if you tell us that these corporations boss governments around. How are little us going to make any change at all? You can be cheerleaders on the side, and good on you for that. But actually the whole thing seems so insurmountable, because we haven't understood the process and how transitions can happen if the right things are done. We would actually like to help you, but we don't understand how we can do that except going to the ballot box and have some sympathy with some people who are put in jail for climbing on trains and such. Silly lot that do that kind of thing. They've got to pay the price, but we respect them in some kind of degree. So the message is not there yet, and somehow it needs to be got across in the way that tonight each speaker has most ably got it across.
Okay, thank you. John?
Thank you. Thanks to all the speakers. I just wanted to make a little comment about China, since it's such an important and huge topic, and needs to be addressed. And just this latest news, which is just pretty staggering, that the US government, the supposed that believe in the doctrine of free trade, are trying to prevent free trade producing any other winner than US corporations. And when it comes to green technology, so put it in inverted commas if you like, but the battery technology and the EV technology in particular, and also the solar panel production. Well, first of all, China has already destroyed the European and North American solar panel industry through economies of scale and through forward-thinking investment and through state-directed investments. They left Europe and North America flat-footed and standing. And now the same thing is happening with electric vehicles and battery technology. And so, as you pointed out, recently they announced 100% tariffs on the import of Chinese electric vehicles. China is already streets ahead of the United States and Europe, who are desperately trying to catch up. They basically did nothing for 15 years when everybody was talking about the climate catastrophe that was coming or already beginning to happen. And China was actually doing something about it. But anyway, there's so much can be said about this, but I just want to make one little parallel in history which helps to understand why this is so significant. And that is, something similar was happening in the 70s, when Japan was actually winning the competitive battle for who could produce the best electronic goods and who could produce the best cars. They were actually beating European and North American capitalists. And so what was the response of the United States? Well, first of all, they forced Japan to increase its currency manipulation, the Plaza Accords as it was called, forcing Japan to adopt measures which made their imports much less competitive. And then they also brought in quotas and restrictions on how many goods Japan would be allowed to produce, similar to what the United States is doing right now to China. And it was that caused Japan to enter what was known as the decades of deflation, where Japan was struggling to avoid being sucked down a deflationary plug hole, and the only thing which enabled Japan to stay afloat, just about, was the fact that the rest of the world was growing, and that they could export, and they managed to just about hang on. And so the same thing is happening when China says that these measures which the United States are bringing in are designed to prevent China from being able to effectively compete in these strategic world markets. That's exactly what they're trying to do, and China can look at Japan and see what the consequences of that will be, which is economic paralysis and enormous disruption. So the point about this is that this is a world war issue. That if what we see here is that the United States and the Western powers are not prepared to share the planet even with new competitors, and that is what is really, we're facing not just climate catastrophe, not just the biggest debt crisis in world history, but also in a pre-war situation on a global scale, and that's what's illustrated by this recent little bit of news about how Biden is blocking China from exporting its more efficient EVs.
Great. And I can take your point now.
I don't have a fully formed question, but I'll try and make it quick as well. I'm thinking about accessibility and not just the availability of the information. I think, how do we overcome barriers like that? And also, I have a family of about 100 people, right? One of them's an environmental engineer, and one of them is a marine biologist. And I can't even talk to them about this stuff, so my question would be, what positive sort of actions can people take to have conversations that don't end up defensive or overwhelming?
That's a really good question. Thank you for asking that. So I'm going to give Tyrone the question on child labour.
Yeah.
Because that's, and I think you can answer that straightforward. Could you also begin to take on that question, which I think I might be paraphrasing from the gentleman just here. I'm not going to paraphrase it, but I think it's looking at how do we talk to the public, how do we influence the public, how do we, so you could begin to answer that, because I think that also then fits into what the woman just there was talking, and then others can pick those up as well.
Yeah, of course, I'll just touch on that, and then questions, so we've got the right answers. I mean, the first answer will be relatively quickish, in that, yes, there's still child labour within the garment industry, within Bangladesh specifically, but not so much as there has been previously, and I guess also kind of informally in a sense. So the garment industry sort of forms part of Bangladesh's formal economy, and with that, especially with things like the accords that were signed and other sort of rules and regulations, means it is technically meant to be very difficult for child labour to exist within the garment industry in Bangladesh. Now, there has been research that's found that in almost every part of the supply chain in Bangladesh, they're still finding child labour, of course, but that would be the official response. But it is actually still even, you know, as me saying that, it is much, much lower than other industries. And one of the biggest risks actually with the garment industry or the consequences, sorry, of being so underpaid and the minimum wage being so low in the ready-made garment industry is that children of garment workers are being forced to leave education to then go into the informal economy where there's less regulation, such as agriculture and farm work, and then they're taking on the work within those industries. But that is still due as a knock-on effect from the lack of adequate wages within the garment industry. But still, either way, the official answer will be no, but yes, no. But still not so much as some of the other countries in which there's maybe a bit less regulation, but unfortunately it still does exist. On the other question, I mean, it's a good question, and I feel like sometimes I've got a really good answer to it and sometimes not so much around how we're able to communicate these issues to general public or to make them more palatable, you know. And there is no quick, easy answer, you know. It could be a sort of long session and debate within itself. But I think one of the key ones is, you mentioned that most people are aware of, you know, global warming or the climate crisis or however we refer to it now, and I think that's absolutely true. I think there was a big battle for some time around getting, which is not everybody, but getting a general recognition that the climate crisis exists, we have to do something about it. And that meant that for quite a while, we had to be, I think, quite fatalistic, cataclysmic with the messaging around the climate crisis and the sense of urgency behind that. And I think as a movement, and there has been a bit of a reconfiguring in how we communicate the climate crisis and the other adjacent crises that are all connected, in that there's a general understanding that this does exist now and we have to do something about it. So it's around moving to solution-orientated comms, because, you know, if we speak around, and it was the case and it's fine, but, you know, 5 years ago, 6 years ago, the rhetoric was often, we have to do this by X point, otherwise it's just too late, you know. And that works for a degree, but then obviously 5 years pass, and when people look out the window, it still sort of looks normal. So firstly, that can sometimes lose a little bit of credibility. And I think the other side of that is, when that happens and 5 years goes and those changes we asked for haven't happened, for example, then people go, okay, we're doomed then, you know. So we kind of be careful in that sense too. So yeah, moving across our narrative that we know it happens now. So what are the solutions? You know, what can a new economy and a new life look like? And I think the biggest thing I'll end on, because I know that we always want to touch on this, is moving towards the benefits of what making these changes means for our societies and for our economies. So how will our lives get better? Because so much of, you know, talk around scaling back industries, you know, to scale back our consumption, we need to scale back how much we're going to fly. We all need to, it makes everything start, well, my life's going to get worse, you know, and that's what people are hearing, and that's what Joe Public, if we say, we're often hearing is, you're taking things away from me, you know. And actually, and this is what we generally believe, is that people's lives will get better if we're not in a society where it's just relentless profit pursuit over absolutely anything else. It's not about exploiting cheap labour. We really look at, how do we value a person? Is it about how much they can produce equates to how much value they have, which then equates to how much income they have, you know? So, you know, when we're looking at, and this is kind of a bit too wide of it again there, but we're looking at solutions to the climate crisis and securing economic justice, it means fairer wages, or does it mean universal basic incomes and reduction of work? Because, you know, we're hopefully not going to live in a future where people have to work 5 days a week constantly, but then right now that's a bad thing, because we attach our wages and what we can do in the world based on our value, which is based on, you know, what we're helping to contribute to produce.
That's
so
quite altruistic though, isn't it?
Potentially, yeah. But I think that's essentially where we're at, and I think that's what we have to try and fight for, because it's, regardless of whether we decarbonise tomorrow, which necessarily won't happen, we could still be exploiting labour, we could still be the rich getting richer, the poor getting poorer, you know, all of these things aren't going to change just because we decarbonate. The climate crisis has been a great opportunity for us to have a real look societally as what's actually going on here, you know, but we can't just then look to pigeonhole and solve one thing. But yeah, it can seem a bit altruistic and can seem a bit like, yeah, blue sky thinking, but I guess that's where anyway, I think I'm taking over time from the other people who've got to give some good answers.
Right, no, that was a good attempt to
Can I
sort
just
of
challenge that altruistic thing? Why have you accepted it as altruistic?
Well, altruistic in a sense of, it is blue sky thinking to a degree, you know,
Yeah.
but that's good. I mean, I'm happy with that. But altruism, I guess, depends if it's seen as a negative term as well. You know, that's the thing. Yeah, yeah.
I think what you mean it negatively, because you know what's killing. I come from I'm an old colonial, so I've been there. As far as I'm concerned, what you've got now is a wage slave economy. Let's be clear about it. People are wage slaves. There are people in America who work 7 days a week, 3 jobs a day. We're wage slaves. So giving them £1,000 a month or £2,000 a month for nothing is not for nothing. It stops them being wage slaves and brings them back into community. Then they can begin to think about things like this. At the moment, they can't. So I think what I'll do is it's damn good common sense.
Yeah, good challenge, I think. Yeah.
Good. So this is what the festival debate should be about. It's about people just coming together and having these. And go, what do you mean that? Why do you say that? No, it's perfect to do that because there's no rights and there's no wrongs. We're beginning to look at that issue of accessibility and availability. We've also got that question of revolution, which you brought up, Andy. So I'm going to throw to you the question again, if you can sort of like begin to play into that question of how do we bring the public towards revolution? How does that happen?
Yeah, I am preaching from the sidelines quite literally here. I thank John, by the way, for his contribution because it's quite important what he's saying. I think it's quite serious. You know, the sort of the first phase of prelude to serious sort of imperialist war is the rivalry over trade. Historically, that was the case. So, I mean, to be honest, one thing you could do is to do a political education on what you've just been talking about China and the US rivalry. I mean, because it's a dominant theme of the 21st century. You know, you can feel it coming. People can feel, you know, the commentariat, if you like, aren't stopping. But it's a reality. It's not just an invention of them, right? It's a very real tension in global politics, and the sort of the lack of control of the US is sort of its hegemony has slipped, right? It's dangerous because all the time the US looks, and the UK normally supports it, right, for military solutions. I mean, the US and the UK are aggressive in pushing in that direction, and we happen to live in the UK. I mean, I'm not joking about the aircraft carriers, right? We don't need them at all, right? We need schools, we need hospitals. What do we need aircraft carriers for? Well, there is only one reason that they're there. It's to project military power to the other side of the world, right? So that's one place we could start. I mean, we should do popular education about the China, US, UK thing, about the role of the British military would be another one, right? And it's not just historical. I mean, historical it is there, but to me it's also like hidden in plain sight. All this celebration around the royal family, I can't stand it. I'm sorry. I'm quite welcome to have an argument with Joe Public about it, right? What are you celebrating is people who are mega rich, right? Who actually exploit all over the world, okay? So let's have the discussion. We should have political discussion about these things. And I'm much less pessimistic today. Things are much more serious, but the response is beginning to happen. And we haven't mentioned it, but there are 3 big things going on right now, which a year ago, I mean, it's horrible, the genocide of the Palestinians, but I am so pleased with the response, you know. And you can see there is a gulf opening up between official politics. I mean, you know, Starmer is as bad as Sunak on these sort of issues, right? And so is Lammy, supposedly my MP. We're going to stand against Lammy, right? Because, I mean, we won't win, but the win is to fight it. Once you start fighting it, you're not on, you know, you're beginning to respond, right? They are openly, I mean, if you look at David Lammy's videos, right? He's happily in Washington talking to the Trumps, talking to the Bidens, right? Celebrating Winston Churchill, right? This is imperialist propaganda by a black guy whose parents were immigrants from Guyana. You know, so it is a change in politics, but I don't criticise him for being black. I criticise him for being an imperialist, right? That's what we've come to, right? It's not white privilege, it's anti-imperialism. And so what we've got is a new phase in British politics. We should all be thinking about what we're going to do in the next election, right? I mean, where Joe Public gets his, you know, one vote every 4 years type thing, right? We shouldn't stand for this anymore. We really shouldn't. We should get organised and find a way, maybe a candidate, maybe a campaign, whatever. You know, I don't agree like with, you know, some of the offers that are around, but we have to create our own response, you know. Everything that everybody said today, right, is not reflected in the main political parties of this country, right? You're thrown out for saying a quarter of what we said on the platform. You wouldn't last, and I'm hearing it's happening in the Greens as well. I'm not sure how true that is. You'll have to tell me, right? But if it's not, I welcome it. If that's a platform, I welcome it, right? Because we need a platform in electoral politics against this stuff, right? So I would say, and the third thing I would say, right, is well done the young people, right? You know, you've got your occupation here, we have several in London. There are lots of things that could be done, actually. It's much more fertile and possible to do stuff now. It doesn't fully answer your question, but I mean, I do think popular political education is a key dimension, and we do need to work on that a lot more and make it much more accessible to working class people.
Okay, so we're really beginning to run quite short time now. I want to bring Daisy in on the question of accessibility and availability again, because Daisy has got that experience of dealing with complexity, and I think it's a really important issue to begin to work out how do we deal with the complex, not trivialise the complex, not pretend it's not complex, but to actually be able to communicate it in ways which is accessible, because it's very hard to do that.
I'm going to answer that by kind of answering both of these questions and sort of segueing from one to the other. I really think the political education stuff is really important. You can tailor that to your particular contexts and audiences. Like we've gone in fairly kind of deep and complex here because of the particular type of event that it is. But you can make this stuff manageable and accessible at so many different levels. I think one of the key things there is tangible ways in which this impacts people. So, you know, the fossil fuel profits thing is a really easy way for people to see that kind of, okay, something's wrong here. There's this massive increase in wealth of these big companies at the same time as this thing that's directly affected me, my energy bills have gone up. So you can use those, whatever those things are, those kind of localized real life examples to help people, because, you know, everyone can see that it's so clear that things aren't working, and there might be different perspectives or different narratives they're being fed on what the root causes of those are. But there's something really tangible and relatable there. People can, and you can kind of go, and actually it doesn't have to be this way. And I think linking in those conversations, kind of linking to the corporations are really helpful, because from a tactical perspective, like having a villain for people to focus on, to be able to kind of see who it is. It's the kind of us and them, without naming and shaming individuals and creating kind of societal divisions. On something that you said about Joe Public, kind of not, you said we don't know about corporations, we don't know about greed. So political education events like this are one way of doing that, but a really good case study on that is the ISDS campaign that we've been talking about a lot. So when that campaign started, like 5 years ago, no one had heard of investor-state dispute settlements. And everyone who was a campaigner in this field was like, this is a nightmare. No one's heard of this. It's some niche, shady, complex legal mechanism hidden within trade deals. It's dry, it's boring, it's complicated, it's completely inaccessible. But we got there. And part of the way that we did that, we started by kind of coining a term. We mostly talk about corporate courts as a way of saying this is a bit more accessible. We found some kind of good comms to be able to make that accessible. And then we activated massive networks of activist groups all across the country who went out to spread the word. So Global Justice Now groups campaigned on it, War on Want groups campaigned on it, loads of other groups got on board, and you reached the point where suddenly people were going, oh yeah, I've heard of this thing. And when you break it down, it's so completely outrageous when you say, forget the complicated terminology, this is corporations suing governments for taking climate action. That's actually all you need to say. And people go, what? You're like, yeah, this is a thing. So we made it accessible, people heard of it, and a couple of months ago, the UK government pulled out of the Energy Charter Treaty, which is the biggest trade deal that uses this mechanism that we're currently a part of. That was our main campaign, and we won on that. And just as an aside, we got, I don't even know how we got this information back, but there was a corporate arbitration conference happened in America about 6 months ago, which is, the belly of the beast. These are lawyers who are pro-ISDS. And the minutes were released from this meeting, and they said ISDS its days are numbered, the tide has turned, we're facing an incredibly organised, collaborative network, basically, of activist groups who are spreading the word about the negative impacts of this. And we were all going, wow, incredibly organised, that's us, this is great. And it was like, it really showed that there had been, that was a grassroots movement spread all across the world, and we defeated this thing. And yes, we defeated that one treaty, but also this then had repercussions for the entire mechanism, which is one of the most fundamental sort of neoliberal mechanisms within all trade deals. And I guess just to very briefly use that as a segue to the gentleman's point at the back, free trade deals are a kind of myth anyway. The global north has constantly sort of wanted to look like it's pro-free trade, but actually since the very beginning of all of these free trade deals, there have been completely unequal, biased mechanisms written into these trade deals that allow, that funnel wealth from the global south to the global north and give massive concessions to the global north while imposing huge tariffs on the global south. So that kind of free trade agenda has always been about preserving global north dominance. But we're chipping away at it bit by bit.
And I just want to add one point to that, really, is in terms of like trying to find the solutions, and how do we move between the different ways of communication. And I think, we've seen so many good examples of how you can cut through without having to do the complexity of what we're saying today, whilst actually dealing with it. So when Greta Thunberg gets up into the United Nations and says it's all just blah, 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 they're three simple words, blah, blah, blah. It expresses so clearly the feelings that people have towards those that are in those rooms doing absolutely nothing on our part. When two young women threw soup over the glass of the sunflowers, they were making a really poetic protest against what do we value? What are we valuing in this world right now? We're valuing, we will criminalise people who take a stand against the fossil fuel industry, against the literal potential for the extermination of their futures. So, and it's done at such a simple level. It draws me towards the ideas of where people in the United States, the Afro-American community of the United States, who have lived with catastrophe ever since the day that they were taken there from Africa, they form these really powerful visionary movements. So they have like the freedom dreams, dream weavers, all kinds of ways of envisioning a society that could be better, and they build it. And that to me, when we look at solutions, we need to build the future that we're imagining. And you get groups like in Jackson, Mississippi, which just was not working. A thoroughly racist state, which the water was not available, food was not available, the healthcare system had been decimated, and they took a stand. They formed a cooperative movement. They started to build food resilience. They started to form mutual aid networks. They formed cooperative manufacturing. They formed credit unions. These are all simple things that can be done at many, many different levels. We could be building that within our community here and showing the future that we want to build, but not only doing that, but building the resilience which will allow us to face the crisis which, as John pointed out, is not one crisis. It's not climate, it's not debt, it's not war, it's not in social injustice, it's not racial injustice, it's all of them. And that feels frightening. So it kind of feels to me in the terms of the solutions and what we communicate visions, we communicate simple steps towards those visions, and we start to do it.
So you've got a question here that's out of sight.
Okay, and then I think we need to sum up. Yeah, so quickly.
Yeah, mine wasn't a question actually, it was a comment. So there's two parts to it. The first part is looking at what we need to do to move forward. What I think we need to do is to grab hold of the press, because the press are brainwashing us constantly. Everything we do is reported in terms of economic activity, whether a bank holiday generates this much economic activity, a strike loses this much for our economy. Every single day we are bombarded with these economic figures. We are not economic people, we're human beings, we can't eat money, and I think we need to take that agenda away from the press. We need to talk about what is important rather than how much of this stuff that is generated. So that would be one of the campaigns I would like to get involved with. Because I think that's the most harmful debate we've got. The second point I want to make is I am a Green Party councillor. So I am going to make a political point now, seeing as I've got the floor, I'm sorry. Everything you've said is what the Green Party is fighting for. We want a universal basic income. We want to defund the arms race because we want to build hospitals and schools. We want, I hate the word degrowth, but we want to change the economic system. So it's not about growing this economic activity, it's about creating a world that we can all live in. So there you go, that's my bit.
Good vision, thank you. For time, can we ask for speak? What do people feel? Do we want to
one
sum
question,
up?
just one question.
Well, I've got two actually. So if we're going to take one, I'll take two. Are people happy to stay for a little bit longer?
Yes.
It's a good debate. Okay, so I'm going to take your point and then your point.
Okay,
Or question.
In 1938, the CWS, the Cooperative Society, was the largest company in the world. The largest in the world. It employed 330,000 people. It worked on a divvy. Every time you bought something from there, you got a dividend. So it saw it, and it had an integrated supply chain. So they had dairies, they had farms, and they were insistent on all of these actually being what's best for the customer. And then after the war, from the 70s to the 80s, they began to take on the capitalist model way of thinking, and they got a management team in that had a way of thinking, and you were sort of the fish rots from the head down. But I do think that model still has validity today. And when I heard someone talk about the way the blacks operated, the Negroes, and how they formed cooperative societies and credit unions and things like that, that is real empowerment. But I think we need something like the co-op back again into what it was, and that's the first point. And the second point I'd say is that we need to start to use the boycott again. It's one of the most effective tools. As someone who was an anti-apartheid student for a long time, it was only the boycotts that worked. And if, for example, we could persuade people not to buy from Amazon for 2 weeks, we would bankrupt Amazon because their cash flow is so minimal. They couldn't take that. So we need to think about, rather than have a demo, have a boycott. Just don't buy that stuff. And that's enough.
Thank you. And you?
Just a quick question, maybe not a quick answer. If the government is so corrupted, as we have heard, if the government is not to be trusted because they are in pockets of corporations, then is it a good idea to plead with the government for the change we want? That would be a question, but more importantly, the next part is there another way that we could subvert the government to achieve what we want? So get around them.
good questions. Good questions.
I missed it. What was the first question before if we can either subvert the government or is there a way to pressure the government? What was the first thing you said?
If the government is so corrupted, then is it a good idea to plead with the government?
Right.
But the more important thing would be, is there a way to subvert the government so we don't need to plead with them?
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. So where's our focus? Okay, so let's answer those questions and make a sort of like a summation at the same time. I'm going to go in reverse order, so I'm going to start with Daisy.
Yay! I guess on the boycotting point, as I said in my speech, Amazon's retail wing is actually one of its smallest turnovers. In fact, they actually make a loss on a lot of their stuff. If you really want to hurt Amazon, you need to go after Amazon Web Services. Amazon Web Services is their biggest profit maker. It underpins pretty much any website, any big institution you can think of probably runs through Amazon Web Services. I actually can't remember the stat off the top of my head, but they control an absolutely insane proportion of all global digital infrastructure. I'm not going to guess because I'll get it wrong. So talk to any institutions that you're part of, your schools, universities, workplaces. They probably use Amazon Web Services in some form, and if you can boycott that, if you can put pressure on big institutions to boycott that, that's where you'll actually hit them.
Thank you.
There's a big coordinated global campaign against Amazon called Make Amazon Pay, and the three big targets there are Make Amazon Pay its workers, its taxes, and for its environmental, for its pollution, its environmental impact. The big thing about that is because Amazon is such a big diversified monopoly that hitting it in any one individual place, it doesn't have that much of an impact on it. The workers' strikes are really, really important, and unionizing within Amazon really important. But by itself, Amazon can afford to wait those things out. They can afford the economic hit of striking workers because they've got so much cash flow from other places. And one of the biggest things that ruins a striking movement is time. They can afford to just wait until people burn out, and you've got such a high turnover of staff in Amazon warehouses and other parts of the industry that they can afford to wait until people have just got bored and left. Make Amazon Pay is trying to link up all of those different separate campaigns. The striking workers, not only in the West, in the global North, but in fact in the global South as well, with the kind of tax evasion campaigns and the environmental impact campaigns. And so far it's been really, really effective at having impacts wherever people want. So I'd look into that. On the, do we work with, maybe, does anyone else particularly want to speak to, I'll let someone else speak to that, because I don't know what to say.
Do you want to just sum it up as well?
Summing up. I feel like I kind of rushed my sort of pitch about the fossil fuel treaty, so I would like to go back to that a little bit, and just to say it's a global South-led campaign. That's why we're supporting it fundamentally. It's a campaign that was started by some of the most vulnerable countries to climate change, like your Southern Pacific island states, like Vanuatu and Tuvalu. And so this campaign is a way of showing solidarity with those countries and getting behind the kind of the demand that they're putting forwards. But it's more than just kind of symbolic solidarity. It's quite easy. There's the kind of tactic with it. The strategy is to create this kind of growing tide of supporters and endorsers. So we're asking people to talk to your councillors about it, talk to your MPs about it, talk to your kind of trade unions about it. And we are getting this wave of people endorsing the treaty. And it's a fairly easy thing to do, and it often follows on quite naturally from previous and existing environmental commitments. Endorsing the treaty gives a platform and visibility to it that pushes it upwards, and then the aim is that we get key governments, we need countries from every different continent basically across the world, and then at some point we will have the kind of, what's the word, the platform, the mandate, that's what I'm looking for, the mandate to be able to actually enact this treaty. So I can hand out flyers at the end. I would really encourage people to get behind that, and it is one of the kind of, I think, the campaigns, particularly within fossil fuels, that has the most teeth, because it's really taking the fossil fuel industry head on in that sense and talking about, you need to stop supply, not just talk about emissions and demand.
And that is something that we in Global Justice Sheffield are focusing on as our campaigning this year. We'll also be taking it to the trade unions, into communities, to the other climate and environmental activists and spaces and other places, because as we've seen tonight, this is all related. So wherever you're working, but we really want people to come on board. It's more than just signing a petition. There is a petition to sign, that's easy, but we want people to come on board and start to work out how do we communicate this and carry this message from Global South countries, because it's very fair, it's just, and it's expressing not only a just transition, but a globally just transition.
And just to build on that, there is something that everyone can do on it and get behind. It's a really easy campaign to get involved in, whether that's helping to spread the word, talking to your MP or your councillors, come and find me afterwards or talk to Global Justice Sheffield if it's something you're interested in. And the final thing I wanted to say was we're also running another conference, another event in Nottingham in 2 weeks' time called From Plunder to Solidarity, and we'll be talking about we've got kind of a whole series of panel discussions and workshops planned on everything from critical minerals to global trade, green colonialism. So if that's something you're interested in hearing more about, then again, I'll be handing out flyers at the end, but it'd be really great to see people there.
Great.
Thank you.
I'm going to pass on now to Andy.
Sorry if I implied something malign about the Greens. I think we've got a lot in common. But I'm a socialist, and I think we should be clear that the only way to actually have a green world is to destroy the system that's destroying the world. So we have to allow for ideological fight right now. I mean, I do actually think it is a big issue about big ideas, we should try work really hard to make those ideas accessible, but not deny the reality of it. It's like we can't just look after little bits and let the big bits look after themselves anymore, right? We as citizens of the world should be engaged in looking after the big bits as well, sort of thing. And that is really my overall point. I mean, everybody's made sort of helpful and good ideas, right? Definitely cooperatives, definitely boycotting. Barclays, we boycotted, or at least I boycotted a student, right, because of apartheid, is the biggest investor in fossil fuels, is the biggest investor in arms to Israel, dropping bombs as we speak on people, in the concentration camp there, basically. So please boycott Barclays. I mean, everybody around the world should be going for them. There's no shortage of, I do think people should take to the streets about the oil companies. You might not be completely happy with how Just Stop Oil do it, but I mean, petrol stations, we need to engage in a conversation about this, It does affect the population. If you saw the backlash around ULEV in London, right? We've got to have this discussion about ordinary people. What does it mean, our ordinary lives? I'm not saying it's the most important thing, but I do think it's part of the spectrum that we should be engaged with, like cheap flights to Menorca or wherever, These things are, we live in a rich country, and we live in, I'm not saying there's not poor people, there are. I mean, there's a class exploitation here, but the overall centre of gravity is completely different to, 3/4 of the world in terms of the way people live. We should show some humility about that, I think, actually. And be prepared to say you're not going to get everything that you want in a future without all this burning up the planet, because it's got to have this sort of restorative aspect to it. So and thank you for having me.
Thank you, Andy. And perhaps can you also do the press? We haven't answered the press question at all.
Yeah, of course.
Have you got anything in there you could throw into that?
Yeah, I mean, maybe. I had a bit more on the government one. Sorry, my knees hurt a bit. And with the press, I've conflicting thoughts, I think, with the press sometimes. Sometimes I think just like trying to subvert that as much as you can anyway, because yeah, the press aren't our friends, and I think it'll be such a long battle to get the right-wing controlled press on our side. Anyway, I think we can build people power, and we can get the message across, and we can organise on a grassroots level without the need of the press, because unfortunately they're just not going to be on our side, not for a while anyway. So I find it difficult with that. Quick search for the time as well. The government one, you know, I think that's a great question, and I've had some really good debates around that, and I've completely changed my schools of thoughts over time as well. So spend a lot of my time talking about how corrupt the government is, UK government, global governments, so it can make you feel quite disillusioned with governments in general, and I get that. I think a big part of it is not necessarily influencing the government that we currently have, although that's a big part of my job and what I do look to do. But I think it's also, as you touched on earlier, Andy, about organising on that ground level and getting people from our movement into politics. Because the political system, whilst it's fundamentally flawed, the processes there still work. It's just the people aren't in there who are adhering to those processes and passing the laws that we need to make the change that we want. Obviously, there's many barriers in our way, whether it's our voting systems and all sorts that get in the way of that. But it's getting the right people into government, I think, is a huge thing. Now, parallel to that, we need to be organising the grassroots level, building power, having citizens' assemblies, mobilising and trying to force through change on the streets massively. And then I think it's some combined effects. It's not one or the other. You know, I've spent as much time protesting in the street as an activist as I have, you know, running for election in the Greens as well, you know, to be a councillor and getting involved in party politics. And I think it's just so important that we look to tackle these issues from both sides. And just for a quick sum up, I'll be quite quick with my time, but it's just the last bits I wanted to make, probably a bit of an anti-capitalist rant, probably. And again, just really emphasising what we mean at Walmart, I guess, around the transition. So I'll try and paraphrase, but you know, here in the UK, with energy, you know, the rise of prices are leaving many in the UK worrying about heating over winter or putting food on their homes. You know, the broken energy system puts corporate profit over the needs of people, the health and rights, and the planet. And this has already left half the population trapped in poverty. Now, the UK government themselves, current UK government, we think they're corrupt. They claim to be a climate leader. They plans to mobilise huge investments in clean energy, but they are still out there expanding fossil fuels, greenlighting things like Rosebank, and even when they talk about pursuing renewable energies, what they're talking about is going into places like Congo and Chile, mining the hell out of it, destroying communities, taking all their water, driving people from their homes, their farmlands, making their water supplies undrinkable and polluting all of their air. So the pursuit of profit and the blinkered approach to just CO2 reductions ignore the child labour, the exploitative working conditions, repression, and the violence. So sometimes I can feel like I'm broken recording a bit, or maybe feel like I'm going against like the climate thing, being like it's not just about reducing fossil fuels, and I'm kind of not interested in a transition that's just about reducing fossil fuels, to be honest. Our report, Material Transition, digs into this a little bit more. So again, just go online and look at all our reports. They've also got like summaries too, because they're quite long. But yeah, it really digs into the need for an equitable transition that doesn't devastate communities. But even against this backdrop, when we know a just and equitable transition is completely and utterly necessary, we're still expanding fossil fuels like it's nobody's business. And that again is down to capitalism. You know, all the available evidence, which Andy explained much better than I'm going to be, is that capitalism is never going to green energy. It's never going to minimise the harm, and we can't leave our need to transition into renewable energy just to the market, because the market profit will always win. You know, so just this week, a couple of days ago, yesterday, we were protesting outside the Africa Energy Summit, which is a summit designed for oil and gas executives from BP, Shell, Exxon, Total, the main 9 or 10. Meet with African ministers and the UK representative to do deals. Yeah, we call it the new scramble for Africa. And I can go into millions of how bad that is, but fossil fuels, an industry that brought nothing to the continent of Africa. It's brought conflicts, ecological and economic destabilization, but it's brought no benefit. Ghana is on the brink of financial distress. Mozambique, liquefied natural gas projects have exacerbated an insurgency into the north, and still 70% of the country are left in darkness. In Nigeria, 6 decades of fossil fuel extractions and all the issues around the Niger Delta, which is a whole other thing again, but the violence, the killings, the destruction of lands and communities is fossil fuel companies. But when it's left to the market, we have things like the Africa Energy Summit in London, in the heart of colonialism. And just to sort of wrap up, but I guess what I really try to emphasise, especially when we're talking about the global south in the African continent, is that the climate crisis is not just an injustice in itself, in that those who are most impacted by the crisis and those who are having their lives and livelihoods destroyed are the ones who have done the least to cause the crisis. But the climate crisis amplifies every other existing inequality and injustice that's been baked into a system that sacrifices the poor, those who are black, who are brown, and who are indigenous. And it already denies so many across the global south the most fundamental of rights to live free and with dignity. So yes, in theory, we could decarbonise our economy tomorrow. We could certainly have shifted, and we're now watching our TVs powered through a in theory renewable energy source. But are we still exploiting the labour of the black, brown and indigenous communities from the global south? Are we still extracting all the wealth and resources that we can? Are the poor still getting poorer? Are the rich still getting richer? Are we still turning half the world into sacrifice zones so we can get the materials that we want to live the life we're living exactly right now here in the global north? So yeah, system change, fossil fuels is one element of it, but fossil fuels haven't caused global inequality and injustice. It's capitalism and endless growth, imperialism and colonialism. And yes, we can end fossil fuels, but those things will still exist if we don't have wide-scale transformative change.
Just very briefly, just thanks to all the three speakers, thanks to Si for his input as well, but especially thank you for your comments and questions, because I think you've really forced the speakers to meet your needs, answer your questions and tell you what you can do. I would like to make the point that I think that most people are more radical than they realise, that they just think that there is nothing that you can do about it. And I wonder if there's a Me Too effect here, that so many women who have been sexually abused have said nothing for years until suddenly a high-profile figure comes onto the stage and suddenly they feel free. They've had examples in the news only a few days ago. Suddenly they feel that they have got somebody else that is saying what they want to say, and they will say their bit as well. So the lesson I take from that is keep talking amongst your own friends, family, neighbours. Just don't put up with what you don't like. Even if you just say you're not going to put up with it, other people will be encouraged to agree with you and say, put their bit in. And people have jobs with specialist knowledge about what's happening in particular firms and particular companies. All of that we can share amongst ourselves. And finally, with that in mind, because we are doing our best as a local grassroots campaign group to absolutely try and raise awareness with as wide a general public as possible, we put out Global Justice and Daisy is one of the best people at that, putting out leaflets that explain issues. But I think that we could do with grassroots feedback from the street about whether these leaflets actually make sense to you or convince you if you're not already convinced. Do you know what I mean? If you're already sympathetic, then you probably, oh yeah, that's fine, I'll agree with that. But I honestly would ask you to have a look at some of the leaflets we've got on the back there and feed back to us anything that you think we could do better with that, and we will feed it back to Daisy. So keep talking. What we need is people power, and that is people's voice, and part of that is the voice that you spread around your own contacts, your own place of work and whatever. So don't be quiet. We need people power. So please pay your bit as well. And thank you for your questions. This is the event in a fortnight's time. I think I've picked up all the leaflets, but
I've got the rest.
the leaflets on the back about in Nottingham, 1st of June, from plunder to solidarity. This will be a good follow-on from tonight. Thank you.
I said next year, the next meeting as well.
Yeah, now I feel a bit guilty about this. I should have said at the beginning, it's free to come in.
Do you want any of these?
But we invite donations on your way out.
Of course, yeah, we've got more at home.
To help us cover the costs.
So,
if you can drop something in the bucket, but only what you can afford. Thank you all so much, and keep.
I'm Shane, as in.
Green claim. Absolutely.
I know Hamza. Yeah. I'm sure we've speaks about that. We've done some recruiting work. I know that. Yeah. I've not read. Yes, we should. And anything that can get that across really well. I think that's the new thing. Just reach out and communicate that. Well, that's the thing. We should do exactly the same thing again. Yeah, that's one job, right? No, of course it won't. There's just no way it doesn't work that way. Yeah, exactly.
You've got to have redistribution. That's the fundamental question.
That's the thing, isn't it? That's yeah, no, but exactly what we're doing there. Well, that's the thing. Yeah, there'll be a point. There'll be that critical mass point. Anyway, I guess where like finally the public realise that because right now that's the threat around climate change communication. Like everything we're saying, these arguments will be taken away from them, and actually the only people taking anything away from them is the rich elites, you know, and that will become hopefully. I don't want it to be a different way, but it will become too obvious but there's no alternative apart from the rich continue to get richer and the poor continue to get poorer, and that's what our system is designed to do. With shareholders develop profits, it's it has to work. You know, so they'll that late stage capitalism I've heard before, like when you get into that point where the bubble's going to burst, and it's just you will kind of want to get to the bubble before it bursts and move to a new system, or it's going to burst and have catastrophic consequences for the world's most vulnerable people. And that's what worries me. Like, yes, I want the system to collapse, but I don't want it to collapse. I want it to be moved. You know, it's. I've not seen that. That's outrageous. Well, that's the thing, yeah.
Thank you. Ah, brilliant. I guess I've got to move it as well, so I'll get your...
Hi, how are you?
About me, I'm all right, thank you.
Good turnout,
yes.
yeah?
Yes.
All right. And my colleague George is talking.
Yes, I think it would have been. I mean, it's. Oh, great.
Yes,
oh, yes, thank you so much.
thank you all of you. Yeah, that's I work for
Oh, okay, yeah. Oh, great. Yeah. It was nice to be back, actually.
I haven't been.
Thank you.
I'm back for a while.
Yeah. Yeah. I'm just right at the station. So,
Yeah, I enjoyed it. He used to have warm tea. I was trying to
oh, really? Oh, brilliant.
unfortunately, people really like it.
Yeah, so